Good afternoon and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's program on Zoom. I'm Georgia Kelly, the director of Praxis, and today we are welcome the organizer of the first Earth Day in 1970, Denis HAYES. After organizing the first Earth Day, Denis took it international, organizing events in 141 nations, and he is still on the board of the International Earth Day Network. Today, he is president of the Bullitt Foundation and CEO of the Bullitt Center in Seattle, Washington. As CEO of the Bullitt Foundation, he leads an effort to mold the major cities of the Pacific Northwest and British Columbia into models of sustainability for a rapidly urbanizing planet. Under his leadership, the foundation designed and constructed the Bullitt Center, the world's greenest office building, which it operates as a successful commercial enterprise. The foundation applies ecological principles to the design of healthy, resilient human ecosystems. HAYES has also served on dozens of governing boards, including those of Stanford University, where at one time he was the student body president, the World Resources Institute, the Federation of American Scientists, and the Energy Foundation. Time magazine named him as a hero of the planet. He has also received the National Jefferson Medal for Outstanding Public Service, as well as the highest awards bestowed by the Sierra Club. His book, Cowed, The Hidden Impact of 93 Million Cows on Americans' Health, Economics, Politics, Culture, and Environment, puts a spotlight on the impact that big agriculture has on the health of the planet and people. So welcome, Denis. It's wonderful to have you here with us today.
It's terrific to be here, Georgia, especially with that wonderful introduction. Thank you.
Oh, I could have done much more, but I thought it might get too long. So my first question actually is a little bit long, but it's to do with maybe making a quick retrospective from 1970, when you organized the first Earth Day, to today. In those days, we called it global warming, but 54 years later, it's the climate crisis. In 1970, fracking was unknown. The wealthy paid 72% of their income in taxes. Governor Jerry Brown built wind farms and was a champion of environmental solutions. President Carter installed solar panels on the roof of the White House. But all the early commitments to environmental solutions in the 70s and early 80s would be undone by a Republican governor in California and by President Reagan, who removed those panels from the White House. So looking back, these changes seem to signal the beginning of the end of policies that would address the climate crisis. What can we learn from the great move backwards that has become standard policy for Republicans? And how can we pick up where we left off 30 years ago with Brown and Carter?
Well, you don't start off with the easy ones. Probably the biggest difference between today and 1970 is that in 1970 they didn't see us coming. There were a number of things dealing with conservation. Rachel Carson had written Silent Spring, and there was awareness of pesticides. Paul Ehrlich was giving speeches on the population explosion, but there was nothing that you would call an environmental movement in 1969. In 1970, with Earth Day, we managed to get, give or take, 20 million people doing something or other out in the streets, which was about 1 out of 10 Americans. Nobody expected that to happen. Those of us that were organizing were sort of blown away. I remember my first experience in New York City when I saw my first crowd of 1 million people stretched out as far ahead of me as you could see, even from a platform. It was like looking at an ocean of people. Then, of course, the next week, Nixon invaded Cambodia. A week later, we had Kent State and Jackson State. The environmental movement sort of fell off the screen until that fall when we went after a dirty dozen members of Congress. And this is where things really began to change. There were a few hundred dirty members of Congress, not just a dozen, and these weren't even particularly the worst, but they were people with bad environmental records who had won their most recent election by no more than 2 or 3 percentage points, where we had strong organizers in their districts who were prepared to work on the election. And when there was a local environmental issue that they were on the wrong side of. We put all of that together, screened for 12 people, went after them, and with a total budget of $50,000, took out 7 of the 12, and clearly defeated them. More than the margin of difference in the election was environmental votes. That was just earth shaking on Capitol Hill. This issue that nobody even thought of as an issue had taken out not only 7 incumbents, but one of them being the chairman of the House Public Works Committee, the guy that if you wanted a dam, a road, a public building, you had to get it through him. And then and I don't mean to go on forever with this answer, but it was a tough question. I'll take just one more minute. That created the context where a month later, Congress passed the Clean Air Act, went unanimously. I mean, there was one dissenting vote in the House and a voice vote in the Senate. And in the next 5 years, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Forest Protection Act, Toxic Substances Control Act, Superfund, 20 to 30 trillion dollars worth of economic shift that took place from the legislation in that brief 5-year period. Now they know that we're there. They have some in their defenses. No matter what issue you want to work on, you now find a deeply organized opposition to it. And it is, as you suggested in the introduction, now enlisted the Republican Party as part of the vocal organized opposition. So it's just a totally different situation.
Yes. Now I wanted to go to the Bullitt Center in Seattle that you were responsible for creating. And the fact that it's the greenest building in the world, I'd like you to tell us something about why it is the greenest building, what was involved in constructing it, how is it different? And also, what are the possibility of green jobs in either retrofitting buildings or in constructing buildings like the Bullitt Center?
Well, in all honesty, there are a handful of places, including some prestigious places, that have termed it the greenest building or the greenest commercial building. I don't know that there's any set of criteria where we could add it up mathematically and say, yes, we are 3 points greener than that one. But it is as deeply green as we could think of making it. And among those characterizations are that it's, I believe, the only 6-story net energy positive building in the world. That is to say, that gets more energy off of rooftop photovoltaics than is used. I emphasize the 6-story because this isn't tough to do with a 1-story building, but with the traditional floor, you don't get additional roof area. And to do it with 6 stories meant that we had to make a superbly efficient building. A LEED Platinum building in Seattle would have an energy use efficiency of probably the high 40s, 45. We have an energy use index of 17. It just everything that we could do to cut down on energy consumption. External Venetian blinds, automatic lighting systems that respond to the lighting that comes in ambiently, so that there's virtually never a light on in the building except in the restrooms during daylight hours. We have what we call an irresistible stairway to try to encourage everybody to walk to their offices instead of using the elevator. There's an elevator, it complies with ADA requirements, but most people use the stairway, and it's a wonderful set of places for people to convene and gather as well on the little platforms between the floors. We get all of our water from rain that falls on the roof that we treat down in the basement, store it in a 56,000 gallon cistern, and get the rain in the winter, and it's enough to carry us through the summer. There's nothing in the building that is toxic. We spent a man-year investigating all the different products that would be used in the building and making sure that none of them on the red list. With regard to labor, it was entirely a union-built building, and I think we had not quite as much as I'd wanted, but we did have programs to bring in new people into the unions and apprenticeships and get exposed to these new technologies. One of the things that we did, and this was really crucial, is we put a lot of effort into educating all of the workmen who were doing that. We began every one of these sessions with that picture of the people that were creating the Golden Gate Bridge, and they'd be up on this beam with their lunch tables and suspended over the water. But what we pointed out was the looks on their faces, the smiles, the sense of contentment. They knew that they were building something that had never been built before and that they had to do it right. And that this building similarly was trying to map out a new approach that was radically less environmentally destructive than most of the built environment. But it would all depend upon them successfully being just superb in the way that they put things together. If you have a 1/4 inch gap along your ceiling for one wall, that would be the equivalent of having 2 open windows all the time. You just have to make sure that there is something that approaches perfection. I guess that's enough.
One other just little question with that. What about heating and air conditioning?
Yeah, we mostly use just the ambient temperatures. When it's warm inside, the windows automatically open or they close when it's cold. The Venetian blinds go down when they need to and go up when they ought to. And they are, again, on the outside of the building. Venetian blinds inside the building don't do that much good. The sunlight has already come through, it hits the plastic, it turns into thermal energy, which doesn't radiate back out of the building. But if you stop it before it comes in, incidentally, those Venetian blinds are so sophisticated that when you want to get sunlight into the building, but it's too bright to glare it, they automatically tilt a little bit so that the sun hits it, bounces up off of the ceiling of the room, and then scatters further and more deeply into the building. And for what it's worth, we also put our windows right up to the top of the walls, as opposed to where most windows are a couple feet down, so that the sunlight goes as far into the room as possible. For the actual heating and cooling that we need, we have super efficient heat pumps. They have a coefficient of performance of 5. So for every unit of electricity, we can move 5 units of thermal or cooling.
Excellent. Yeah, that's very interesting. Now, there are 2 questions that are somewhat similar, and I wasn't sure which one to ask first, but I think I'm settling on this one. Because you did connect the Vietnam War with the environmental movement, and I'd like to have you look at the environmental impact of war now. I mean, between the war in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, the other wars that are sort of happening all over the planet. How do you explain the environmental impact of these wars and how dangerous they are to the climate and to our well-being?
That's one of the catastrophic consequences of the World War II and post-history is that what was one time battles of armies against armies have now become battles against populations and economies. And just like the devastations in Nagasaki and Hiroshima and Dresden and Tokyo, we now see in acts of war, and not just world wars, but war in the Ukraine and in Gaza, the absolute devastation of everything, and far more civilians being harmed than military, and leaving just rapt destruction. In Vietnam, of course, we were focused upon the impacts of Agent Orange, both on the environment of the country, but also on the increased number of stillbirths and birth defects in the population. And taking it to its ultimate, if we ever find ourselves in World War III, you could make a decent argument that World War III will last about 72 minutes. That's how long it will take to kill the first 2 billion people in a full-out exchange involving the 3 superpowers. And then a larger number of people will die more slowly from radiation poisoning and starvation due to nuclear winter. I mean, it's just, if you're thinking about environmental insults, you can make a pretty compelling case that although we speak of climate change as an existential issue, nuclear war is the true existential issue. That's the one that could not reduce us to poverty or even destitution, but literally wipe out the species.
Yeah, when you sent that email to me about that World War III would last 72 minutes, it was kind of shocking to read that at first, because I think right now it seems like the global picture or maybe the US particularly, are just flirting with the disaster of a third world war. Between what's going on in Gaza, I just saw that at the UN, we were the only country that said, no, we do not want to recognize Palestine in the UN. All the other countries either voted for it or two abstained, but it seems like we're causing a lot of the trouble that could lead to something like a third world war. And how close do you think we are? I know this is not an environmental question, but since you told me that 72 minutes stuck with me, how would you define it?
You know, one of the terrible things about it is that it's absolutely unpredictable. I mean, it could happen as a result of an accident, as a result of a technological failure. A complete dingbat leader of a nation with his thumb on the button can touch it. You never can take too seriously what Donald Trump says, because he says everything on every side of every issue. But one of the alarming things was when he was having early on in his administration these exchanges with the head of North Korea. He was saying that if that guy continues to threaten us, we are going to go over and rain on him. And I can't remember the exact words, but the greatest fury that has ever been pushed by any country on any other country. It was clearly talking about not responding to a nuclear strike, but if this guy has the audacity to challenge us, we're going to wipe him out. I mean, which would suggest that among the lunatics with their thumbs on the button, they're not all overseas. And then you were speaking earlier about the rising number of autocrats in the world. Mm-hmm. You become very possessed with your own power if you are a Putin or a Xi. Or we could actually get a pretty severe nuclear winter from a full-out nuclear exchange between India and Pakistan with their current arsenals. So what are the chances? They are far greater than I wish that they were. I mean, that's one of the big shifts from back then to now. And with all of the arrogance of youth, and I'm guessing many of the people on this program have this, it never occurred to me that we wouldn't be passing on to our children a better world than the one that we were inheriting. And in fact, we are passing on a scarier world than the one that we inherited.
Yes, I mean, I've often thought about where our thinking was back in 1968 or 1978, even 88. No one would have seen we would be where we are today, or that Trump would have been president, or that we would have one party that was so oblivious to what's really going on the planet. I want to go now to the book that you wrote called Cowed: The Impact of 93 Million Cows on America's Health, Economy, Politics, Culture, and Environment. Can you imagine a way to change our culture that is so dependent on food that is killing the planet?
Well, and it's killing us at the same time. It's a fascinating topic, much more so than I thought it was going to be when my wife persuaded me that we should dig into it. Because if you actually like cows and you don't want to have them disappear as a species, I mean, nobody's ever going to want to watch cow or a lap cow. I mean, the one function that cows have is to provide milk and beef. And no one's going to, I think, have them in wild areas. I mean, you can't take a cow out to the end of the pasture and slap it on the flank and say, okay, Bessie, you're on your own. I mean, they depend upon us for their continued survival in their current shape. So in that sort of context, the answer to your question is, as it is in so very many things, moderation. I mean, if everybody had the equivalent of a quarter pound of beef a week that was raised humanely and entirely grass-fed without the ravaging impact that grain fattening has and that the resulting lagoons have on our environment, it could all be relatively healthy. The problem is that we have a huge number of people eating incredible tonnage of beef And you see these examples, such as the President of the United States. And, you know, this was common under Clinton as it was under Trump. It is, we need to have exemplars that people like, respect, want to be like, that have meaningfully different diets. And, we've been relatively unsuccessful at pushing a vegetarian diet. I think the total numbers are on the order of 6%. And this is after a half a century of trying to promote it. But to get people to eat dramatically less meat, and especially dramatically less red meat, I continue to think should be possible. Having said that, that was the objective of our book, which sold like 7 copies. Not one of our most successful ventures. I will say that the fault there is entirely, well, sort of entirely mine. I had accepted a 3-month sabbatical in Europe with the Bosch Foundation, and it turned out that our publisher published our book 1 week before we left the country for 3 months. The initial marketing was
You couldn't
a
promote
pure
it.
benefit.
Well, I think that that movement has gained more people recently, maybe, or at least it's certainly getting more young people involved. I wanted to ask you about going back a little bit to the era between 1970s and the early 80s, when it seemed like we were really on a trajectory to deal with the climate. And yet it all got, not all, but a lot of it got turned back by the people who were in office. And you did point out, which I think is interesting, the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. I mean, some of those happened under Nixon. So this was before the Republicans became anti-environment. I don't
Not
know.
necessarily, I need to, Richard Nixon vetoed the Clean Water Act, and he was overridden just completely in both houses of Congress by such a margin that he never vetoed any other legislation. But don't confuse Richard Nixon with
Okay,
John.
thank you for that. Yeah, because a lot of times when I read this, it's like he oversaw it, but I didn't realize how he opposed it. But I'm glad he was overridden. But later on, it became a thing with the Republican Party that they're anti-dealing with the environment because it hurts business. Anything that hurts business, they're opposed to, or they think hurts business. So I wanted to ask you if you see any signs going forward that the climate problems will be dealt with more effectively, more thoroughly, and with a deeper understanding of what has to change in a very short amount of time, because we are running out of time now.
Interestingly, of the big issues that are facing humanity, war and peace, population, racism, climate change, I think, is probably the easiest to address. We knew the basic fundamentals of what we needed to do under President Carter. In fact, he had this goal of getting 20% of the nation's energy, not just electricity, but of all energy from renewable resources by the year 2000. I was responsible for leading the research institute that was supposed to put flesh on that, and we gave a 1,000-page detailed map to get there, much of which would have held up quite well. And it turns out, though, that the big innovations that we were pushing for were done mostly by the Germans, the Danish, and especially the Chinese to get us to where we are today. But if you look at the installed capacity of electrical generation in the last 12 months in the United States, over 90% of it came from renewable resources. About 50% of everything came from solar and batteries. I mean, we're moving fairly aggressively in that direction already. We're beginning to see increased emphasis upon efficiency just because prices have been going up so high. Electric vehicles, they seem to be having a little bit of a pause now, but for a while they were just on a rapid escalation. The technical parts of this, I think, are relatively straightforward. The difficulty is that as you do it, some very powerful economic interests, particularly the petroleum industry, the gas industry, the coal industry, and the most unfortunate parts of the electric utility industry are all in opposition and will do whatever they can to slow it down. But boy, if you look at the stuff that is in queue, and when you're talking about electrical stuff, until it's in queue, it's sort of DreamWorks. Something like 90% of all the electrical generating capacity in the United States today is in renewables. It's just stunning. And they're having trouble getting it linked up. The grids are viewing themselves as being saturated. It turns out that you can do various things without having new power lines. If you just keep the existing poles and put different wires on them that have a carbon fiber down the center with aluminum wrapped around it, you can get 50% more power going down through the same corridor. There are things we can do, but that we're not doing, mostly because there are people that don't want us to do them.
Right. Which brings me to my last question, is about the degrowth movement. What do you think of it? What are your ideas about the degrowth movement?
I think it's absolutely essential. The amount of physical throughput being pulled out of mines today is not sustainable. But I don't see a way to get there without first having a movement toward a far greater equality around the world. As long as you have some, I mean, if you look at the environmental impact of billionaires compared to the environmental impact of the lowest 2/3 of the economic spectrum globally, it's like 70,000 times as much. It's just absolutely awesome kinds of numbers. That's not the 1% or 1/10%. It's just the billionaires. But my goodness, it's staggering, and huge dramatic changes between the 10% and the 1%, and the vast bulk of people as well. You know, for many in the world, if you're telling them that you have to have less next year than you had last year, that's just unacceptable. They're barely surviving. So until we have a more equitable distribution, I can't think of any way politically to get to degrowth.
I recently saw that Biden was wanting to, or suggested that we have a larger tax on people with private airplanes, that their fuel be taxed much higher than other. I mean, that might be something going in that direction. But I like Bernie's ideas where we shouldn't have any billionaires.
Yeah. No, that's right. It's really difficult in American politics to tax wealth as opposed to income, but I think ultimately we have to. And to the extent I'm sure everybody on this call knows people of substantial inherited wealth. And for the most part, it produces these disasters. I wouldn't go quite to this, but who was it? George Bernard Shaw, who was arguing there should be a zero income tax, but 100% inheritance tax. Some part of that philosophically appeals to me.
Right. Well, now I'm going to open it up to other people on the call who might want to ask questions. Maybe it takes a minute usually before they do that. They're thinking. I have a feeling since Jerry just unmuted, he's going to be the first one. Am I right?
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks. I just wanted to get some clarification on the statement that 90% of generated capacity is in renewables. Could you, expand on that a little bit?
Sure. In fact, if somebody can send me your email address, I can send you the material from the Energy Information Administration. I was saying that of the capacity that was built last year, some of which has been hooked up to the grid and some of which has not been hooked up to the grid, but the stuff that was pushed in the last 12 months, something on the order of 90% of it is a combination of solar being dominant, utility scale solar, next being land-based wind, then I think next being batteries, and then after that, offshore wind. Offshore wind has been running into big problems in the last year or two.
Right. So the clarification for me is you were talking about the most recent addition over the last year, not the total energy.
That's not even close in terms of total.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Ned?
Yeah, thank you. This is a real pleasure to hear you, Mr. Hayes. So my thing I'm wondering about in working in just on the climate side mostly is it just seems we need a cultural transformation to really make the change. And you must be working on, or you contributed to that for 50 years. What are your thoughts about what it's going to take to shift our cultural awareness to the point where we really start to take action and do something real instead of just playing around the edges? Thank you.
You know, the typical comment, Ned, for this is always something that sounds a little bit like the greening of America when we were young. That if you just look at the attitudes of young people in schools and recently departing schools today, they do seem to be dramatically different than their parents. And to somewhat approximate what ours were when we were in college. I have this, I've never acted on it, but I've long had this sense that there's a potential coalition of the grays and the greens, the geezers and the kids. The sandwich around the parents.
That's cute. Looking for other questions? Yeah, I think what Ned just brought up about this cultural shift that's needed, you know, it applies to almost everything. It applies to the diet that we're talking about with vegetarianism or eating less meat. It applies to energy use. It applies to so many things. And one of the areas, being a peace organization, that I've been so focused on is how war is being promoted in our media as a game, like it's a football game. Well, this side's winning now or it's not winning. And it's just horrendous to me that the questions that should be asked are never asked. You know, like, why aren't we negotiating? Why aren't we helping end these wars instead of continually fueling them? So that's a whole other thing, which we don't need to get off on, but I had to bring it up.
It is, in fact, but that's one of the reasons I was saying that climate is easier than war. You figure out what you can do as an individual, as a family, as a community, as a state. And with war, it's difficult to figure out what Sonoma can do to make war less likely, to probably things. On the cultural question, let me scratch an itch for just a moment. I have been attacked for half a century now by the left because I think that behavioral change is really important. And they all say, man, you're talking about somebody picking up litter, and what we got to do is have this radical change in Congress to change the legal and regulatory framework within which we all operate. And that's actually crush capitalism. I'm sort of, well, okay, but the way that you achieve those changes in Congress and in the regulatory framework and perhaps in capitalism is by building a movement. And you build a movement by having people do things that show their commitment to it. And the more that they do, the more they are likely to be committed. It's like we're ignoring 2,000 years of the way the religions have operated, where, you know, when I grew up, if you were a man, you had to take off your hat when you entered the church. If you were a woman, you had to put something on your head when you entered the church. Absolutely no sense to it. It's just a way of affirming something about yourself. Don't eat meat on Friday. It's silly stuff, but we've actually got substantive stuff that if everybody does it, if everybody does make their house just as efficient as they can, they buy the most efficient vehicle, ideally electrified if you can afford it. All of those things become just staggeringly important, but they also allow you to commit yourself to something in a way that is visible. And when you're talking to people about the issues, then they don't think of you as a hypocrite. I mean, for me, if I write a book like Cowed and then go out to McDonald's and order a hamburger, whoever is with me is going to think I'm just a complete asshole. But it's viewed as being terrible when environmentalists ask people to change their lifestyle, because lifestyle is basically what culture is based on.
Right, what we believe too. Bob, you have your hand up?
Yes, you mentioned the lull in progress on electrical vehicles, but what do you see the future of electrical vehicles in terms of the transportation burden of this country, maybe even globally, but of this country at least?
I think they are inevitable and will probably come pretty rapidly. They would be here right now if we didn't have trade barriers to getting vehicles from China. That would knock Americans manufacturers really back for more of a stint than Tesla did. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening in battery chemistry now, moving to solid state batteries, moving to things that give you 500-mile ranges and are much lighter weight than what we currently have in cars, have higher energy density and higher power density. There is a community, including people that I respect, who really think that the future is in hydrogen instead for vehicular transportation. But I think what's going on in batteries right now is just much more exciting. But once again, getting to the degrowth thing, we have to, and I can't emphasize this enough, we have to put in place the recycling plants to make sure once you've got the batteries out there, when they come to the end of their lifetime, that all the lithium is recycled, the cobalt is recycled, the copper is recycled. And we have to do that with our solar technology as well. The valuable stuff that is now coming off of rooftops after 30 or 40 years and going to the dump instead of to a recycling plant.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. That's the big breakthrough, I think, is the technology and recycling and reuse. There's a lot of industrial uses for batteries that are now we're going to be transforming our industries to use batteries that come out of cars, because they're past their lifetime for transportation, but they can go into other services. But I bring that up because there's a lot of naysayers that basically point to the energy and the resources that it takes to make batteries as being the downfall ultimately of that. And I think there are solutions. So thank you.
Yeah, no, that's just not true. You can get back the amount of energy that you put into building a battery as opposed to an internal combustion engine in about maybe 3 years of operating the vehicle, and has a life expectancy substantially more than that. And that's without recycling. I do think that, well, let me put it this way. I'm leasing a Tesla. I have never had a car as neat as my Model 3. I mean, it's become like a member of the family. We call it Tessie. We take care of nurturing it and feeding it. It performs just beautifully. It's safe. I have on 2 occasions, both for longer trips, gone to stations where I charged it up. For everything else, I just charge it in my garage and drive around town. I'm in love with that car. I hate Elon Musk, and whenever this lease expires at the end of this year, I will not get another Tesla just because of that. But I'm really going to miss it. I think that this change is happening. We now have more than 200, it might be more than 300 large 18-wheeler trucks that are battery powered on the roads in California right now. I mean, this thing is coming. And of course, California State, this is a place where Newsom versus Trump and maybe versus Biden will rear up. California is giving a very substantial subsidy to BYD to bring in a load of, it's a Chinese company, to bring in a load of battery school buses for the state. So when the school buses paused at a place, the engine isn't running and the kids aren't getting waves of pollution coming in through the frame and through the windows.
Jerry, I'll come to you after David, because David hasn't had a chance to ask something yet. So David, go ahead. David Corton?
Yeah, I had to unmute. Dennis, you're so on the forefront on green building. I'm surprised on the issue of cars that you don't mention walking and bicycles. A friend and I lived a few years in downtown New York City, and it was it was really an extraordinary experience because you got to be out of your fucking mind to have a car in New York City. And the city, at least as we knew it, was designed to meet all your needs, either walking or with public transportation. And it seems to me that that has got to be a necessary part of our thinking about the future. I wonder where do you stand on that?
Well, of course, David, I'm right with you. And, you know, when I do my shopping or go to the library or any of that stuff, as long as it's within 2 or 3 miles of my house, I will walk. And when I was in Seattle, I typically bicycled. The cars, you know, if I want to go to Ventura, then I'm going to jump in a car. I'm not going to walk. But I can blend the two elements of your question together by looking at the Bullitt Center. It does not have a parking for automobiles, but it does have a parking for bicycles, and has within it a bicycle repair shop as well. We felt we didn't need a place for cars, in part because we have bus rapid transit is going up Madison and has a stop essentially in front of the Bullitt Center. We are within 8 blocks of light rail. We have a number of bicycle rental stalls around for people who don't have their own bicycles. I mean, it's just so easy to get around Capitol Hill in Seattle without a car. And we're doing our best to make it difficult for people to bring cars into Capitol Hill.
And that's the thing about Europe, is everywhere you go in Europe, you don't need cars. And I've spent a fair amount of time in Europe, and I've never had a car. I don't rent a car. Public transportation is incredible. In Sonoma, where I live, we've got train tracks here that used to be operational, but as of 1960, they were no longer operational. So we're removed from places with public transportation, and that's not fun. So I'll go to you, Jerry.
Yeah, this is just really to follow up on what the most recent comments. To me, there's an inherent conflict between a really strong emphasis on green technology and especially EVs versus a more cooperative approach represented by what Georgia was just talking about, which is more of a reliance on things like transit. And so I would just add to what David was saying. I would like to hear in your approach a little more of an emphasis on the cooperative approach, like much more of an emphasis on transit. And what Georgia was saying, the obvious that we're way behind every other developed democracy and even not just democracies, but anyway, every other industrially developed country when it comes to transit.
No, absolutely. I've among the many failures of my life has been strong advocacy of high-speed electrified rail. I went to Japan when I was 19 years old, and they already had their bullet trains operating between Tokyo and Kyoto. I mean, when I was 19 was a very long time ago. It's just an embarrassment that we haven't made some progress. I mean, China in 10 years has built hundreds of miles of this stuff, and we have, I think, a small stretch between a couple of obscure mid-California cities that Jerry Brown got started, but I don't know if that's going to amount to anything or not.
Well, it will be. It's not yet, but it will be.
Yeah, I hope that you are right, Georgia. The difference here is that it's breathtakingly expensive, and it's now breathtakingly expensive to go from one place I can't remember to another place I can't
Like
remember.
Modesto to Fresno or something.
Yeah. In any case, technologically, it makes a great deal of sense. And in the United States, it is really difficult to get right-of-ways for that sort of thing.
If we could just take the money away from the wars we're funding and put it toward transit, we'd be much better off. I think I'm just going to take maybe one, well, maybe two, but depends how long. One, okay, we got Kimberly and Alan. Alan was first and then Kimberly. Those will be the last two questions.
Well,
Alan?
thank you very much. I mean, we actually have a way to pay for this with the House Bill 4052 for a national structural bank. So that would be the way to get the money for this. And Europe, China have many of these infrastructure banks. And so we don't have to stick the money in the Wall Street banks. Now, how do you see that progressing, David?
Dennis?
Dennis, so sorry.
I'm not familiar with the particular legislation, but I've seen a number of these proposals and they all look very attractive and they all have to get through a Republican Congress.
Right.
I will say that money is always a big part of this stuff, but there is something else that's going on. It's the in much of the world after Curitiba pioneered bus rapid transit, you have scores of cities that have constructed this stuff all over the place and they work just beautifully. You've got this corridor that effectively runs almost like a rail corridor and it operates just super efficiently. In Seattle, we're building maybe 2.5, maybe 3 miles, probably 2.5 miles of bus rapid transit. They've been working on it for 15 years. I mean, one reason that we felt so confident that we could do this thing at the Bullitt Center was that bus rapid transit was supposed to be available in a couple of years. We opened the Bullitt Center 10 years ago, and it is still not there. We have to figure out ways. We in California, the Public Utility Commission just made it vastly more unattractive to put rooftop photovoltaics on. In Australia, they have had an alternative set of approaches to rooftop photovoltaics, so that in California you decide you want to do it, and typically within 1.5 to 2 years you've got all of the necessary permits and variances, and your homeowners associations. In Australia, the average time from the time you decide that you want to put it on till the time that the project is completed is 2 weeks. I mean, there are things that we can learn from the way that other countries are doing things, and we just can't stop everything in America.
Yeah, we're behind in a lot. And our PG&E here, which is our privately owned utility, should be a public utility. It should have become that after all the disasters they were responsible for. So I'm going to go to Kimberly. You will be our last question. Do you want to unmute?
Great, thank you. Dennis, you had made reference to the younger generation being hopefully the environmental activists. So I'm not familiar with really what's going on in terms of academia's curriculum now. Do you find them kind of a major power source in terms of the research that's being done and an emphasis on environmental studies?
Yes, it's really been transformational. When I was in school, there was nothing that was called environmental studies. And now we've got environmental everything, environmental law, environmental engineering, environmental everything, literature, history. And for people who have an interest in these topics, there's stuff in every university that they can pursue. There's what I was talking about, though, is something a little bit different than that. Though we do have to have more people who are really focusing upon the science and technology of this stuff that are entering into the workforce. But I don't want to get all woo-woo here, but there is a theory that biologically species have these compelling instincts for the survival of the entire species, and that they will make sacrifices in order to in the best interests of the species as a whole. I'd like to think that there's something like that that's beginning to occur with regard to the threats that are facing the planet, and a sense of almost a survival instinct that you find among today's youth. And I don't mean among all. I mean, we've got a great many people wearing red MAGA hats who are 18 years old, but somehow there does seem to be a disproportionate number of those people as opposed to of 30 to 40-year-olds who understand the depth of the crisis that we're facing and the kinds of steps that are needed to address it. And if they can hold on to that as they get a little bit older and get married and are caring for a family and have all these other responsibilities, if they can somehow manage to keep those values intact, I think it will be really hopeful.
That's one of the things that I've noticed, with Praxis and with our programs and conferences and things we do, is that there's a certain age demographic that we never get. And it's that group between 40 and 55 when their kids are in school. They don't come to even live events. And a lot of it is because they're so occupied with their children's extracurricular activities, whether they're sports or ballet lessons or piano lessons or taking them to friends' houses. There's so much they're doing in that time of their life that it's very hard to keep people engaged and even that educated during that time. And I wonder if you have any thought about that. That particular demographic.
Yeah, no, I think you are right. I suspect it probably always happens. I mean, when you have other weighing responsibilities, you've got a job you've got to go to 40 or 50 hours a week. You've got kids that you are taking to various activities. You have these other conflicting things, so that the public well-being gets relegated to a back tier, except when an issue is absolutely front and center and seems to constitute a gigantic threat. And we were able to do that with regard to things like air pollution and water pollution and toxics. And I'd like to think that that with particularly the climate issue, we're going to be doing it again. And frankly, I think the two can work in an interesting cooperative way. All of those parents who are taking their kids to their ballet lessons or what have you, among all the things that they want in life, really want to be a hero to their kids, really want their kids to think highly of them.
Mm-hmm.
If those kids come home and this is really a top issue for them and requires some changes politically, some changes in what they do with their house, what they do with their car, what they do with their commutes, what they do. I think parents are going to be responsive to what their children expect of them.
The dinner table conversations.
Yep.
Change people's minds. So I want to thank you, Denis, for being with us today. Do you have any last thoughts you want to impart to all of us?
No, just my deep embarrassment not to have mentioned walking and bicycling and.
Oh, don't worry about that.
Interesting, a technology that I really wasn't aware of till we moved to Southern California. I mean, not aware of, but not thinking of as a major transportation, is electric bicycles.
Mm.
Just astonishing. In my neighborhood, I would think cars still dominate, but more than walking, more than bicycling, electric bicycles are everywhere. And mostly it's bicycling, but with that electric assist when you need it, it really is an intriguing technology.
Yeah, I haven't seen that
No, I
many
don't.
around here.
Sorry?
I haven't seen that many around here.
Yeah, no, they're most popular where you don't have much rain. In Santa Barbara, we have 52 weeks of perfection and 2 weeks of flooding every year. So 52 weeks of electric bicycles.
They're everywhere where I am in Dana Point, everywhere.
Yeah.
Anyways, no, I enjoyed this very much. Thank you for inviting me, Georgia. It was
Well,
a fun
thank you so much, Denis, for doing this. I will send you and everyone here and the people who couldn't make it, the video link tonight. So you'll have the program and you can do with it as you wish. It'll be on our YouTube channel and then we'll make it public in a couple of weeks. So thank you again, Denis.
So long, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Anyone want to say anything before we stop?
On electric bicycles, if you now go into RAI